Hi, welcome to this panel on personal data protection, ethics, and human rights. It's my great pleasure to chair it today. My name is Dr. Cherine Hussein, and I work on the politics of resistance in the Middle East and North Africa. And as someone who sometimes works with interviews and speaks to intellectuals and activists linked to these emancipatory movements, this topic is of particular significance and interest to me, so I'm very excited to welcome these speakers and to learn a lot more about what they do. As you all know, this panel on personal data protection, ethics, and human rights, the themes are of great significance to everyone these days, because from our browsing history to our precise locations, from the apps that we all use, to our Gmail accounts, all this data is collected by big tech companies. So do we agree with these terms and conditions, or are we more often just forced to agree with them? How much are individuals protected in cyberspace? What are the key ethical and human rights considerations in this new environment? These topics are some of the topics that our speakers are going to touch upon today. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all. I guess we're going to start in kind of the way that I got the program. So we're going to start with Miss Josephine Ballon, who, after studying law and completing her legal clerkship, has been working as a lawyer since 2017. In November 2019, she joined HateAid as head of legal, and she campaigned against hate and incitement as part of the No Hate Speech movement in Berlin. She advocates to improve the legal framework for those affected from digital violence who are left largely unprotected against violations of their rights on the internet. And she was invited twice as an official expert to the legal committee of the German Bundestag. Ms. Josephine, the floor is yours, but I would just like to tell everyone before we begin that you will each have up to 15 minutes to speak, so please don't speak longer than that so we can have a long and fruitful discussion, after which I will open the floor for a Q&A with the audience. So the floor is yours, Ms. Josephine.
Thank you very much. I will do the best I can with the timekeeping. So I will just start right away and share my screen for a little presentation to explain you and introduce you to the work of HateAid, which is the organization that I'm representing here today. So HateAid is a consultation center for victims of online violence that is based in Berlin. And what we offer to the victims is, in the first place, counseling in many ways, which means we give them emotional support to deal with the situation that they find themselves in. But we also give them cybersecurity counseling. And this is exactly the angle that I'm looking on the topic that we are talking about here today, which might be a slightly different angle, but is a very important one these days, considering that many people do not really think about which information they provide on the internet about themselves, how important it is to have secure passwords, to not be hacked and to not see that your data is used against you on the internet in a huge shitstorm that can really cause a lot of harm. In the worst case, it can mean that your address or other personal information is leaked and can never be removed from the internet again. No matter if we talk about big online platforms like social media or other smaller websites where this can happen, and which may lead even to the consequence that you have to move to protect yourself and your family. So this is the aspects that we are looking on in this topic, and where we also think that law enforcement has a very crucial role in fighting online violence, because if we don't enable the victims to act against what's happening to them on the internet, then we really have a problem, because we as a society rely on the victims not being inactive and not just enduring what happens to them. That's why we support the victims in filing criminal complaints, because we think this is very, very important in fighting online violence. If the only consequence that perpetrators have to fear is that the content they publish is removed, then we will not see a lasting effect in our public debate. And we also encourage the victims to go into litigation against perpetrators, but also against online platforms and defend themselves in court, which is why we are offering financial support and also the support of specialized law firms that really help them to protect themselves against personality rights, which is not easy and costs a lot of money and takes quite some time because the legal framework in Germany and many other member states of the EU is just not fit for the digital age. Also, we are creating public awareness with our work. We talk a lot with law enforcement. We talk a lot about the judiciary and with politics about what's happening on the internet and what are the needs of the victims. And we also aim to improve the general framework to enable the victims to stand up for themselves without the help of a consultation center like ours. So what did we achieve so far? HateAid was initiated in 2018, and since then we consulted more than 1,500 people. We offered litigation financing and criminal complaints in more than 500 cases, which adds up in total to more than 150 clients that we supported to take legal action. Who's reaching out to us here? Who are the people seeking our support that we work with? The people that reach out to us mainly belong to marginalized groups. That means all groups that are already discriminated against in the analog world experience the same in the analog world. And of course, intersectionality also plays a huge role here because the more criteria for discrimination comes together, the most likely it gets that you will be attacked on the internet as soon as you speak up. We see a lot of activists, we see a lot of journalists that seek for our help. We also see a lot of politicians, especially local politicians, are not very well protected. They don't have sufficient support structures. And we even see that these people, like journalists and politicians, we know that also from official studies, that they start to withdraw from the public debate already and to no longer report or speak up on certain things because they are because of their experience with online violence. So these are only a very few examples that we consider to be very, very normal. So I could have brought much more drastic examples, but of course I'm not here to shock you, and I also don't want to read all of this aloud, but just to give you an overview of what people, and especially women who are the biggest but one of the most affected groups on the internet from online violence experience on a day-to-day basis. We see that people experience a lot of insults and defamation, and also threats of very different kind, from rape threats to death threats. We see it all. It comes on social media, websites, in the commentary sections. It comes via email. All these things are possible. We see the misuse and manipulation of pictures, where I did a mistake in writing. I'm sorry for this, which is a very, very common problem. That pictures are stolen on the internet. They are manipulated. We even saw this in our election campaign that we just had, where the female candidate for the chancellery was used, and her face was used in nudes, and these were spreads with the hashtag "she was young and needed the money." So it has become that far, but we of course also see that in very normal people that are not federal politicians, but activists or otherwise active on social media, for example. We see that a lot of fake profiles are set up to spread lies about the victims, and we see a very, very dangerous form of publication of personal data, where we see that personal data is really found on the internet. It's searched for, the social media feeds are scrolled up and down for years to find information that can be used against the victims, to have a very high effect of intimidation, and also to create a very analog threat that really makes people think about if they are still safe in their environment. What we see is that online violence are not set single cases that just happen from time to time. We see that it has become very normal already on the internet. 78% of internet users in Germany have already witnessed online hate speech. We conducted a recent survey on our own, where we found out that in the European Union, already 90% of the young adults have witnessed online hate speech or online violence of different forms. And we also see that, especially from study to study, we are confirmed in the fact that especially young adults are affected very heavily from online violence in general, because we have to consider that these people, they don't know the internet before everything went wrong, and after this, they are young people and they only know this one internet that they grow up with. So this is what they live with every day and what has become very, very normal to them. So this may look like everybody is just very hateful nowadays and with just going on the internet and spreading hate and agitation. But this is actually not what we are observing, and this is also not what studies about this topic show. We know actually that behind this online violence, there's a strategy. There's a strategy of very few individuals that spread this online violence on purpose, and they do it also in a very smart way, because they understood how the algorithms of online platforms, for example, work, and how they can be manipulated and used for their purpose to create an effect that is really tremendous. We know that in very hateful commentary sections of Facebook, it's only 5% of the users that are responsible for 50% of the likes to hateful comments. What happens is that not only the victims are intimidated by this, and they really think about it twice if they want to participate in the public debate anymore after it happened to them. This is worse enough. But we also see that especially all of us as a society, the bystanders, are affected by what's happening there. We see that 54% of internet users are already scared to express their political opinion on the internet, because they are afraid to become a victim themselves. And this, in the end, is really a threat to freedom of speech of all of us, and especially of the people that do no longer dare to speak up on the internet because they are afraid of online violence. We also see that this is a threat to our democracy, because it creates an unequal opportunities on the internet, and people do no longer feel safe. To wrap it up, I just want to quickly point out also the responsibility of online platforms that were mentioned in the very beginning here, because protection of victims and support of victims, counseling of victims has its limits, and these limits are imposed by private online platforms, and which are dictating the rules of our public debate, because at some point we decided to put our public debates in the hands of these privately owned online platforms that just operate on their own rules, the terms and conditions that are already mentioned here. And this is something that we have to be aware of when also talking about online violence and protecting the victims, because these online platforms, they play a very crucial role. What is our experience from 3 years of counseling victims and of supporting victims also in litigation against platforms is that we unfortunately see a very, very little incentive to protect the users from all sorts of online violence. We see that also when we talk to law enforcement. They say that they cooperate only on a very arbitrary level. Of course, this is partly due to the missing legal framework in the European Union, for example, to investigate about perpetrators. The limit opportunities of law enforcement are unfortunately very limited. So this is a problem that we have. But also, we have to see that there's rarely any cooperation in user protection in very particular. So, of course, we sometimes talk to the platforms, and we also want to have direct lines to the platforms that enable us to protect the people that reach out to us. But we see that this happens on a very arbitrary basis, and especially the intransparency of content moderation is a problem that we see, because terms and conditions are applied on a very broad scale, but still we do not understand if there's a pattern and how are the chances to act against certain kinds of content, because the terms and conditions, they are formulated in such a broad way that almost any decision can be justified by referring to them. And we also see that the terms and conditions are oftentimes used to circumvent the law. In Germany, we have a law that is already meant to regulate social media platforms. It's called the Network Enforcement Act. And there we see that they circumvent the application of this law wherever they can by using their terms and conditions and by trying to not comply with the consequences that this law brings. Which is, for example, to have a point of contact in Germany that can be reached in German, but this, of course, only applies to decisions according to the law and not decisions according to the terms and conditions. What we really need to protect users better on the internet, from our experience, is equality of arms. This is how I like to call it. I really want to see that at some point in time we have clear user rights that really have some reliable proceedings for the users, where we can really say, like, you can use, to be very, very clear about this, you can use this button, you will receive an answer within this deadline, and then the decision is this or that, and you have these kinds of actions to choose from if you want to do something against it. We also need more transparency, content moderation, because so far, it's very unclear what's happening there. And we also need more transparency in algorithms, because when we look at victims of online violence, it's very unpredictable how far the content spreads, where it spreads, what happens to it, because of these algorithms that will just show the content to as many people as it wants without any control. We also need more choice and education of users on privacy matters, which is, I think, quite clear. We have to make sure that online platforms cannot exploit the profiles of people that easily, and also users have to be more aware of which data needs to be published and how can I use, for instance, privacy settings and all the tools that we already have, but maybe also more tools that we get in the future to make my information safe. And I want to stress here that I do not want to motivate somebody to withdraw from the internet because of these letters and to no longer participate on online platforms in the public debate, but we want to make people secure on the internet. We want to enable them to move freely without any worries about being threatened with any very, very analog threats that exploit their data. Okay, thank you. That's it from my side.
Thank you so much, and thank you for being so punctual. That was exactly 15 minutes, so thank you for that. We're going to move on to Dr. Cameron Ashraf. Dr. Cameron Ashraf is Head of Human Rights at the Wikimedia Foundation, an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy at Central European University, and is the co-founder of international human rights and technology organization Access Now. He completed his PhD at UCLA on the geopolitics of internet censorship and cyber war. And in recognition of his work, the European Parliament selected Access Now as a finalist for the 2010, if I pronounce it wrong, let me know, Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought, the European Union's highest human rights honor. And he has advised the International Criminal Court on digital security, and given expert input to the offices of U.S. Senators Lindsey Graham and John McCain on global censorship policy. The floor is yours, Dr. Ashraf. Go ahead.
So thank you, and I'll share my screen really quick here. Great. Well, let me start my timer. Be sure I can be as punctual as Josephine. It was so nice to be invited to be part of this panel and to be here with everybody. Thank you. I'm going to, and thank you for the introduction. It's always a little embarrassing to hear so many things about yourself. But anyway, so that was a bit of a background about me. And I want to talk a little bit about a more unconventional way of thinking of human rights challenges and big technology platforms. So first, I want to give a little bit of a background about some of the contemporary issues that are going on that I'm sure you all have heard about. first, the Facebook files, if you have read those, it was really quite eye-opening into seeing how Facebook was regularly failing on basic human rights protections. To summarize some of the points that were more relevant to me, your Facebook, it fails to police a lot of the content in much of the world, chooses, user engagement, therefore, measurable items in order to facilitate its profit motive over user safety, and deliberately targets children. We've also had a big crisis with human rights in Afghanistan. It's an ongoing, just as a aside, it is an ongoing crisis and situation. I do encourage you all to donate to support food security in that country. But aside from that, back to the technology side of things, we have issues, for example, of it being quite difficult for users to delete content, delete their name or photographs, and their real name policies on platforms actually endanger Afghans, because the Taliban can potentially use these platforms essentially to find out individuals to be targeted for reprisals. And then we have, unfortunately, the usual privacy and surveillance concerns that we are all quite familiar with big social platforms that we hear about quite often, at least once a month. Something crosses my newsfeed where it's yet again another privacy concern. And I also want to briefly highlight here some what I call non-charismatic rights. Now, in environmental activism, there's a concept called charismatic megafauna, and it's the idea that certain animals are very charismatic. Elephants, polar bears, these larger animals, they really can help motivate us to actually engage with climate change and to engage in environmental destruction. And I see the similar concept that has occurred in human rights. Privacy and surveillance, freedom of expression, these are very charismatic rights. There's lots of headlines about them. People get really animated about it, get excited about it. But other rights are impacted by technology and social media platforms as well. Freedom of religion, freedom of assembly and association, generally negative differential impacts on women's rights. To highlight a recent paper I published with my co-author Cherine on online violence against women in Pakistan. For example, many women in Pakistan will maintain 2 Facebook accounts, one that can help maintain public morality, and the other one where they can actually be themselves. And these sorts of rights rarely make, headlines or are particularly exciting for many people. They're not non-charismatic rights. But I could spend a lot of time talking about, all these different things, the way technology gets things wrong, the way these social media platforms, are failing us, and so on and so forth. But I've been in this field a long time, as you heard in my introduction, from 2009 when I co-founded Access Now, and as we came out of activism work that I was doing for human rights with Iran. And the key common denominator, I've seen this now for many years, and this is my presentation is more focused on an honest conversation about this, is that human rights, first of all, is predicated on the idea that people are human beings. And when we look at all these, it's quite a radical idea, actually. If we think about ourselves, if you get to know yourself or you get to know others quite intimately, and you can really see how complicated and how complex people are. You talk to your families, think about it. Your family, you can have incredible anger at them and incredible love at the same time. It's quite complex. The core issue, as I see in social platforms, is the idea that they struggle with, is that the idea that people are human beings. This presents a really big challenge in social media platforms and technology on big tech, because big tech inherently categorizes people into users, customers, community, and then interacts with them in that way. We all do that. We, on a personal level, we talk about our networks, our field, our colleagues, and these were sort of abstract categories. But that presents a really big challenge because people are complex. And if organizations are going to platforms are actually going to address, human rights issues, they're going to have to actually realize that people and work with the fact that people are quite complex. So the diversity of rights that we have, freedom of religion, freedom of opinion, my favorite, the right to leisure. I definitely enjoy leisure, and I think it's quite an important right. But the wide extent of human rights actually is representative of the complexities of the individual. Each individual person has this enormous range of humanness to them. And one of the quite I have observed over the years the recurring problem we have online when it comes to social media and human rights is human complexity is repeatedly ignored, right? When we ignore human rights, we're ignoring human complexity and boiling people down to whatever category we've created for them. How do we, whether that be user, community, or what have you. So there are some easy ways that are quite common that you hear about in this space in terms of addressing human complexity online. Human rights impact assessments, following the UN guiding principles on business human rights is all great stuff. Diversity in hiring and management. We can see this, for example, with if Facebook had more women from Pakistan that were working there, there might be certain exceptions made to the real name policy, or it might be dropped entirely. And these can bring a different perspective. Greater consultation with civil society and academia, having internal human rights mechanisms and ensuring that these mechanisms are actually allowed to make impact. This is all quite, standard stuff, and I think it's very important. But the hard stuff is what I'm more interested in focusing on. In a very recent paper by Kanz et al., the research showed that organizations which really emphasize getting things done and what they call locomotion are more likely to have serious ethical lapses. And this is something, unfortunately, is quite normal. I don't know any organization that is not interested in getting things done. It's an unfortunate sort of reality of capitalist state that we're in right now, when there's an overemphasis on getting things done and a lack of emphasis on actually what are we doing. Everything gets boiled down into a series of, agenda items, points, actionable items, and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the research is showing us that that kind of approach is actually creating the problems that we're actually trying to address. So when we actually start to think about how do we have secure human rights online, we have to recognize that human rights is really quite a cultural shift. It's a shift. It's an enormous shift. If you think about it in your own life, right? That means, addressing individuals as real complex individuals, going through our lives and interacting with people in quite humane ways. So organizations are confronted with both, external and internal pressures to do more, but then the reality of successfully implementing human rights programs requires a massive shift of thinking quite carefully about what we're doing. For example, a relatively small tweak, just to keep using Facebook or Twitter, on one of these big platforms could have enormous repercussions for many different kinds of people. One policy that sounds good in San Francisco is quite different in Kabul, has quite different impacts. A real name policy sounds great when you just to use that as an example, a real name policy sounds great where you can share your real name, but it doesn't work so much when you can't do that elsewhere. Or banning multiple accounts, might be fantastic, in San Francisco, but someone in Lahore who might have to maintain, as I talked about earlier, what they call digital purdah, the publicly moral account, and then a more private account. It doesn't work for them, and these accounts often get shut down. So it requires us to actually recognize that, requires these organizations to recognize that everything they do impacts lots of other people. And that is quite a different shift, right? Every action, it requires us to think, to get out of this sort of local biased mindset that we have, to really recognize, to live in the 21st century and recognize a lot of interconnectedness. And as the research is showing, making organizational space for thinking and reflection can even parliaments slow down a bit and take some time to think about what are we doing? How are we doing it? How are we engaging with the world, and what are we doing if we're going to actually have human rights take root in technology organizations? And an important point is engaging honestly with critique, right? This is quite difficult. On a personal level, whenever somebody have a criticism from somebody, whether it's a partner, family member, or somebody at the grocery store, I always believe that there's at least some kernel of truth to what they are critiquing me about, whether it's 1% or 99%. Of course, my ego says it's 1%. I'm 99% right. They're 1%. They're 1% right. But that's for me to do the work, right? But taking that spirit that there's something that they see about me that I don't see, is quite important. And we often see, you know, this team building that happens at these big social platforms, you know, the Facebook team, you know, the Twitter team, the Google team, whatever. They really build a strong organizational culture, but that contributes to organizational tribalism, right? So when we have, you know, a greater intergroup, you know, cohesion, we have greater intergroup, you know, dispersion or separation. So then, of course, when these platforms are faced with critiques, there's immediately a retreat to the organizational tribalism. We rarely actually get to see, you know, any sort of thoughtful engagement. And, you know, this is evidence in the way whenever there's a critique of many of these platforms, there's a rush to put out new mechanisms or platform, new reports or public statements or so on. And there's the American mythologist Joseph Campbell talked about there being two types of being lazy, doing too much and doing too little. So we will often see organizations do too much in order to actually avoid really wrestling with the critique and how to move forward with it when it comes to rights. This is a security forum, so I do want to briefly touch upon some of the security angle. You know, as I've been hinting at earlier, human rights failures online tend to come from a myopic vision of the platform and a myopic vision of the person, right? One thing that was really touching for me to see about when Facebook went out recently was people were talking about what WhatsApp meant to them. So the platform is often viewed as a product, but not a source of meaning. So this myopic vision can actually contribute to a lack of successful human rights implementation at an organizational level. So these sorts of structural and organizational changes that actually, you know, that would come from implementing human rights more deeply, you know, this sort of reflection or sitting and facing critique honestly, ultimately, because these rights are emblematic of the complexity of the individuals, contributes to greater security. What's good for someone in Kabul's security is ultimately also going to be good for someone in San Francisco's security, is my point here. And of course, incorporating, you know, this is not to say this is all easy stuff, but part of our goal in these sorts of platform, in these sorts of, you know, events in civil society, academia, is to be a type of a conscience for the field and to provide this kind of critique from the outside in order for them to perhaps reflect on it, I would hope, and see it. There's only so many scandals I think, you know, these organizations can have. At least at some point, well, hopefully, you know, there will be some sort of more thoughtfulness about this, as the research is showing. But it's complicated. It necessitates a complex sort of reflection on what the platform is. As I talked about earlier, it's both this technology product, right, but also a source of meaning. WhatsApp means a lot to people. Facebook, lots of things to people. Facebook means a lot of things to people beyond just the interface and the user design, right? And that meaning is a part that platforms tend to ignore, that rarely can actually talk about. So, and it also necessitates both this internal sort of cohesion and working across different units. You know, for example, as I was talking earlier, if you want to sort of reflect on how does this platform actually impact people, it requires not only, let's say, product designers, but also systems engineers, advertising teams, and so on. So it's quite a complex situation, and also working across organizations, you know, across tech space. So finally, final slide, you know, these challenges to human rights online, you know, on these platforms can't be reduced to these simple policy points. We've done that for enough years, but it's going to require significant changes to perspectives and to organizational culture and behavior, to seeing more complexity. The prevalence of these more nuanced discussions that we've been seeing in the past few years about human rights and technology, about what it means to our society and our way of being, to young people, to women, to differently able people, and so on, is really, really encouraging. And finally, you know, therefore, you know, taking it that and seeing people as human beings as complexity, and then trying to build platforms and, you know, structures and policies, you know, around that complexity, both contributes to a greater respect for human rights, and ultimately, as a result, you know, really does make a significant impact towards greater security. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for a super interesting presentation, and thank you also for being super punctual. And our next speaker is Marco Kruger, who has been working as a research associate at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Tübingen. And his research focuses on the conception of resilience and the societal construction of notions of normality in the realms of security, as well as on security ethics. And he's going to talk to us today a little bit about arising challenges from datification for human rights and the importance of privacy for a democracy. Take it away. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Cherine, for the nice introduction. It's my pleasure to talk today at a conference that puts data protection and privacy up front and not on this Friday afternoon session when hardly anyone is there at the conference. So it's really great to be here and to be part of this wonderful panel. Within the next around about 10 minutes, I would like to talk about 3 points. So firstly, I would make a point why privacy matters, and not just data protection, but why privacy is important, not only for individuals, but for democracies as such. In a second point, I would like to address at least 4 challenges that are linked to our ever-increasing datafication of society. So, how is having a private sphere getting harder through datafication? Is here my point. And in a third point, I would like to propose at least some avenues to remedy some of these problems. First of all, privacy. So privacy is important for democracies. Privacy is not a gift to a citizen or to society, but privacy is a very precondition for upholding democracy. We can think privacy as a precondition to act as an autonomous individual, for having this kind of sphere in which I can act independently of others. So thinking privacy in terms of different layers might be a good thing. In the first layer, I would argue that there's a spatial sphere of privacy, like our homes. So everyone, I guess, would consider his house or her flat as a private thing, as a private space where we can act independently, where even state authorities have only limited access. In a less spatial sphere, we do have decisional privacy. That means if a particular decision only affects us as a human being, then we do not owe someone justification, and it's our private thing, what we do. And in the third layer, and that is my main point in the next 10 minutes, about we do have informational privacy. So in this layer, privacy is about the control of who knows what about me. So who can I get, or who do I get, and deliver what kind of information. So while data protection is a precondition for this informational privacy is more than only data protection, because it's this sphere, this control. It's not just giving nothing to anybody, but of having still some notion of control over who knows what about me. However, datafication and the increasing datafication of society poses some challenges to upholding data protection as a human right and informational privacy as a precondition for democracy. The first challenge is big data. So big data is, by saying big data, I mean the combination of different data sources to see emergent correlations, data patterns, and so on and so forth. Big data means that we do have emergent information. So if I give some information to a company or the state or to whoever, big data means that out of these information, new information is created by creating different data patterns. And that means that there is information about me out there I don't even know that it exists. And a problem here is that I, of course, do not have control over this kind of information. Another problem is that big data is not about who I am as a human being, as Cameron said. It's about who I am like. So what kind of data pattern do I correspond? And that's de-individualizes me and dehumanizes me in the end, because only this kind of data pattern, this kind of data fitting is of interest here. And one question could be, how can we protect people from discriminatory decisions? Because we do not have a fitting credit score to obtain a credit, for example, because we live in the wrong neighborhood, or because our living living style corresponds too much with people that are not creditworthy. This is one particular challenge we need to address, dealing with human rights and datafication. Another topic is artificial intelligence, and this morning's panel already discussed it a little bit. So artificial intelligence, in contrast to big data, means that we do have algorithms that are self-learning. So algorithms get trained with data, and if this data is crappy, then decisions, of course, are crappy. But even if this data is good, then self-learning algorithms still adjust to a learning environment. That means that it's very hard, if not impossible, to trace particular decisions back and to say if a decision is based on a racist assumption, for example. So if we do have an expert, and this expert says a particular justification, we can certainly identify if this justification is racist, is sexist, xenophobic, or whatsoever. But if we do just get a decision from a AI algorithm, then it's pretty hard to assess whether this decision is based on problematic assumptions. And moreover, it is really problematic to see who can then take responsibility for a particular decision. Is it the security operator that exercises the decision proposed by an algorithm? Is this the programmer of the algorithm who has problematic assumptions, or who is it that is being held responsible for a particular decision? A third point is the spread of data, and here I come back to the individual. So people just distribute data in various ways. So there is not always awareness given that data is a commodity and that it's problematic to spread one's data. So linked to the first two challenges, we need to have more data literacy among people to tell them and to help them to decide what kind of data they do want to give in what situation. Because people are not always aware of the consequences, and they cannot be aware of every consequence that arises from giving data to an institution or somebody else. And fourth, and this is a very important point, particularly in the security setting, there are more and more mixed human algorithmic decision-making settings and routines. So we do have a human operator at the end who decides on travel restrictions, for example, if you can enter a plane. Or we do have predictive policing that allocates police forces in different parts of the city to a different degree. And these decisions are supported by algorithmic routines. And it's not quite clear that human operators are trained or in any case able to decide whether a proposed decision, a proposed result from the algorithmic is sensible, is useful, or whether they should refuse to enact this decision. And how can human operators in the end refuse algorithmic decisions without the knowledge of how this decision is has been created? So we do have here the problem that human operators find it quite difficult to refuse to exercise then algorithmic decisions. However, they carry the responsibility for the decisions they make and they exercise. So this is really a problem when it comes to security routines at airports, at borders, etc., and which affect human rights. So what we can do? First of all, and I think this was also a topic in some previous talk, individuals cannot protect data by themselves. We do need strong state regulations for having sound data protection. For example, we need user rights. For example, we need safeguards like the Gdpr, of course, but we also need safeguards that correspond to dynamic data sources. So, for example, if we have big data decisions or AI decisions that rest upon social media data, then we do have data-based decisions that rest on dynamic data, because social media data change over time, because we use social media, because we use different channels. and how can we assess at a later point of time what was the data basis for a security-related decision in an earlier point of time. No human rights safeguard can protect us here at the moment, and this is a problem because people use more and more social media, messengers, etc., that are then subject to a certain dynamic. We need to increase data literacy. That means we need to educate people. We need to help them to make decisions they want to make. And this is also a public task, and we need to do it as a democracy, as a society. And democracies need to grasp privacy more as a resource and data protection more as a resource to preserve democracy rather than as a threat that might prevent them from getting terrorists, criminals, etc., etc. So, of course, police work is important, but police work needs to respect data protection. And as a last point, we need to set up criteria how we can create environments that allow sound human apparatus decision with algorithmic support structures. So we do need to spend more energy in thinking through how to integrate algorithms into complex security settings. And these are my propositions. So I'm utterly positive that we can do it, but I think we think too much in a black and white scheme, that data protection might be either a bad thing or an individual thing, but we need, as democratic societies, grasp data protection as prerequisite for privacy, and privacy as a precondition in the end for preserving democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an equally stimulating intervention, and also for being super punctual. So we will move to our last but not least speaker, who is Markéta Gregorova, and she is a Czech politician who is a member of the European Parliament representing the Czech Pirate Party, and she serves as the vice chair of the delegation to the Euronest Parliamentary Assembly and is a member of the Committee on International Trade and the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the EU, including disinformation. The floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and being able to speak here among the esteemed experts. Considering my role, I thought that I would mostly focus on the legislation in place or that is actually being negotiated right now in relation to our topic that we discussed today. So, of course, I'm talking about both GDPR, which is already in place, and Dsa and Dma acts, which are currently being in the final negotiation rounds. So to start with the GDPR, to put it into a context, as a lot of you already know, GDPR is not truly enforced or has not truly been enforced, even though it has been passed, which is because the Irish Data Protection Commission, combined with the Irish government's tactics to court international tech giants to Ireland with record low corporate tax rates at 12.5% and effectively no enforcement of GDPR cases, has made the GDPR practically unusable for individuals for the first years of its existence. And right now, after several years, the other national competent authorities figured out the scheme, and we are slowly relieving the Irish from blocking our data protection rights through other member states and court cases, though. With the European courts, various decisions to annul the EU-US numerous transatlantic data flows provisions. European consumers got a bit of a taste how the EU can protect their data rights, though. Not simply sending our data over the Atlantic into a privacy regulation desert for US giants and the NSA to profile and surveil European individuals en masse and in real time, that is a very good start. not to be too pessimistic about the GDPR. I actually think that, in theory, it's very good. I just want to put it a little bit more, to shed more light on the practice. And so with that, I would like to move to Dsa and Dma discussions, because these might face and are facing very similar problems in protection of data of users and, of course, other. The DSA itself aims to reshape the internet by altering the power imbalances between big dominant platforms and people using them, us. It would also help to ensure an open environment where the likes of Google and Facebook are made accountable and where credible alternatives to their services that respect fundamental rights and are people-centric exist and are interoperable. And I would get back to it in the DMA part. And the DSA could also ensure access to justice when people seek remedy for unjust situations, for example, wrongful takedowns of legal content. So very ambitious, let's say. But for a meaningful DSA to come to fruition, general rules such as a ban on general monitoring of content obligations towards platforms must remain, while at the same time bringing systemic changes to the current business models based on absorbing people's data and experiences, making them addictive to their services, and instead enabling decentralized, local, user-owned and privacy-friendly alternatives, allowing people to escape from the data-hungry digital silos where they are now currently stuck. And the DMA, on the other side, aims at opening digital market by establishing limits to current digital gatekeepers, aka the big tech monopolies. It will be based on two pillars. First, a clear list of do's and don'ts for digital giant gatekeepers. And second, a harmonized market investigation framework across the single market to tackle market failures and prevent future gatekeeping threats from happening. This will be done by, for example, letting users move between interoperable services and by harmonizing rules so that the application of competition policies are coherent throughout the European Union. As with the GDPR, there is a big question of enforcement. DMA places a heavy enforcement burden on the Commission, as is the DSA actually, who will need to gather and analyze an enormous amount of data, particularly during the launch phase. And to be able to meet the extent of its responsibilities, the Commission will have to expand the number of its officials, but also its skill set to include inter alia computer and data scientists. And the latter absence of technical know-how is already being considered one of the reasons behind GDPR's enforcement failures. And I think this is very important point for both DSA and DMA. So allow me to summarize this issue as my final point. Both enforcement mechanisms in DSA and DMA are highly reliant on the Commission and don't provide an enforcement role to national judiciaries. By allowing itself to adopt non-compliance decisions and impose heavy fines to the organizations, the Commission is more than the executive arm of the European Union. It is also applying its law and punishing lawbreakers like a court would do. Another element highlighting this role are the procedural rights recognized to the services and gatekeepers, such as the right to be heard and access to the file. That is, of course, if member states do not come into action and create an Irish-type non-enforcement system during the negotiations once again. So what did we learn from the GDPR? Apparently not enough. And I'm saying it as also the legislator who is part of this process, unfortunately. Both the DSA and DMA are centralizing most of their enforcements around one institution, the Commission. And to avoid facing similar issues of latency and inertia, it seems crucial to better involve member states while providing a swift timeline for their contribution and probably provide the judicial power with a bigger role. Thank you for being able to share my thoughts with you, and I look forward to this discussion.
Interesting and informative intervention. I'm going to open the floor up for questions from the audience, but I would also like to invite the speakers to engage with each other if you feel like you would like to. So you are welcome to do that first right now. So go ahead. If anyone has any questions, let me know. No? Okay. Otherwise, I will take the first question from the audience is to all speakers. Should algorithms be delegated detection and decision-making regarding hate speech? What are the risks in your view? And the second one, also, I guess, addressed to everyone, is the EU intends to request information for cryptocurrency exchanges, asking for the identities of senders and receivers. How will this framework work with GDPR? Go ahead.
If nobody else wants to start, I can start on the first question if you like. So from our experience and also from my personal point of view, of course, there is a high risk in letting algorithms do content decisions. I think we are all aware of this, and I would be very surprised if the other speakers do not agree with this fact. So that's why I think that algorithmic decisions cannot be only way of content moderation. There needs to be a human oversight over decisions, because in both ways there's such a high risk of limiting freedom of expression by applying these algorithmic systems. They can be overblocking, but on the other side, there can be also underblocking with a look to marginalized groups that are not covered by most of the algorithms that we see today. That's why human oversight is very important, and also redress mechanisms are really important. And that's why I'm also happy that these are already implemented in the DSA, although we have to see how this evolves in the end, and if everybody also has access to these redress mechanisms, because in the very beginning they were only supposed to be accessible for the ones that are affected by removal of their own content and not by the notifiers. So just to pick that up, I'm really happy that also the topic of the DSA was raised here in that detail, because we see that this will be very, very relevant for all users in Europe of online platforms. And so we really should, also discuss this here.
To comment on that? Or take up the second question? Yeah. Go ahead.
I would just add to what Josephine said. You know, I think that the sort of algorithms for hate speech, I think they can be important in some sort of very preliminary level of detecting some sort of common hate speech tropes. But I would also add, you know, in addition to the human oversight of the actual content moderation portion, that also some level of, you know, auditing or oversight of the actual algorithmic development. Because these algorithms, you know, they reflect the biases of the individual programmers that work on it, the teams that develop them, you know, whether that bias is from, you know, due to gender, sexuality, religion, geography, socioeconomic status, and it can really reflect how what they consider hate speech to be, which might not be what the victim considers it to be. So, you know, ensuring humans are present at every stage is also quite important. So not just in the deployment, but in the development as well, is my point.
I completely agree with that, and actually, I'm really grateful in a way for everybody's emphasis on the human aspect of this debate, which doesn't get mentioned often, but obviously people play a role in this, and the link between people and how they perceive knowledge and perceive each other and perceive what hate is and how they define these things is very important. So thank you for that. Would the other two speakers like to, should I move on to maybe Marco? Or go ahead, please.
Marketa raised her hand.
Sorry?
I will just speak. Thank you very much, Marco. I just wanted to add that I completely agree with the previous speakers. I think that what like the writer of the question might have also in mind have been using algorithms later on for founding the already fact-check hate speech or disinformation to be found across the platform and dealt with accurately how the platform deals with such things. I think that is good use of algorithms. That is definitely possible, and of course increases the efficiency of tackling this issue. However, as has been mentioned, the fact-checking and the first identification has to be done by a human. And I also raised my hand to just quickly ask you please to repeat the second question, because it has been about crypto and identification and GDPR, and I thought I would really love to answer that, but I did not hear it properly.
Actually addressed to you, and it is the EU intends to request information for cryptocurrency exchanges, asking for the identities of senders and receivers. How will this framework work with GDPR, in your opinion?
Thank you. Well, one part is the ideology behind this itself. I personally do not believe that this is a step in the right direction. I think that the basis of the cryptocurrencies is actually not in the identification, and I do not think that this industry will thrive anymore if we try to pursue something like that. But you know, the question is more focused on how would it be possible to connect it onto GDPR. Well, GDPR includes for individuals and their data, in theory, the right to be informed, to be forgotten, to access, to object to data portability. So, of course, all of this should be made possible. The thing is that the reasoning behind, let's say, the will to identify the users of cryptocurrencies is usually to identify thefts or illegal proceedings. And in this regard, of course, there is becoming a little bit of gap between GDPR and the criminal justice, which, however, is really difficult to suddenly, without any definitions and proper legislation, to be applied onto, you know, the online and crypto industry. So I do think that this is very complex topic. I do think also that it's not a good step in a good direction, but in relation to the question, I don't think that currently GDPR would be possible to apply to such cases, unfortunately, which is a problem.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to another question that's actually linked to this issue. And the audience member asks, what are the tools individuals can use to protect or ensure its data will be eliminated? Facebook, for example, does not delete a permanently deleted account. If any of you would like to comment, go ahead. Maybe we can start with Josephine and go around. But if you don't want to comment, you can skip.
I can start. Of course, I cannot speak for the legal situation in all member states because I'm not familiar with all the options that you have in your member state. But of course, there are options. I think Facebook deletes the profile after a while. At least this was my last state of knowledge that I had, but it keeps it stored for a while in case you decide to come back. So that's what I knew about it. But in general, you can ask to have your information deleted from websites in the European Union, and also from blogs and whatever you want. But sometimes it's very hard to pursue these rights because we have the problem that we have transnational situations here where it's not that easy to just go to platforms, to reach out to platforms, to access these platforms. That's why the emergency exit that we sometimes use in the cases where we see that it's very difficult to reach the platform, and there's just no option to also even litigate against a platform or file a criminal complaint against a platform that is registered in Sri Lanka or wherever. Then we use the removal mechanism in Google, actually, that can be used to at least remove the information from the search engine results, which is already some kind of help, because the information cannot be found just by using the search engine anymore. But actually, this is a point that really good highlights also the fact that users have really few options to act against these platforms in the European Union with the transnational aspects that we are dealing with here, because there are severe lacks of law enforcement from a criminal side, but also from a litigation side. So all the aspects that users have in their own hands, where we really see difficulties in pursuing the rights of users in the European Union overall.
Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to comment on that question? No, in which case I will. We have a few more questions from the audience.
Maybe I can follow up.
Would you like to go ahead?
If that's okay.
Please.
Okay, good. So yes, to add a bit of a different take, one of the things that I've seen with my students is over the many years is, of course, they have a really, really good sense of wanting to control their privacy and their data and to be mindful of what's put out there. But then I also see that is sometimes limiting their enjoyment of the platform, where it becomes a source of anxiety. I mean, there's already enough anxiety in the world and anxiety with these platforms, so that people often can be quite overly protective of data, which might not really be so detrimental if that data is out there. Yeah. Sorry, Christine, can you hear me? Because it seems like the stream is frozen. Okay, who knows? But the stream looks like it's frozen, but I'm going to keep talking. And if not, at least maybe the people here will find it interesting. So here we go. Okay. But yeah, so, I think that there's also, there's an important limit in terms of how much should we be mindful of our data versus how much does that sort of overthinking paralyze the real positive sides of the use of these platforms. I think that there's a lot of creepy stuff that happens there, but I also, for example, I get enjoyment out of sharing some things with friends, and but I try to be mindful with that. But the one thing I do always recommend is ensuring that you have downloaded proper tools for your browsers that will limit the tracking of those little share on Facebook buttons when you go elsewhere. Which is super creepy, but also again, to reemphasize, I think these platforms can be enjoyable experiences, and that being mindful of our data sharing, shouldn't prevent us from also the positive uses of these platforms, which can be tremendous, have tremendous impacts, positive impacts for our lives, for human rights, for lots of other things. So just a bit of a different take, and hopefully that appeared. If not, well, here we go.
We can hear you well, so it was all good. Would anyone else like to comment?
Looks like both the other speakers have their hands up. So.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry, I can't see that, but go ahead. Go ahead, Marco.
I was first before, so please go ahead now.
Thank you, Marketa. Yes, I think we should think more about the right to be forgotten in general, because I mean, we are now in a time when people with a Facebook profile or a Instagram profile whatsoever also die. So we do. So, for example, how do we cope with data from dead people? To whom do they belong? Is there a right to be forgotten posthumous? So how we deal with that? That's a deeply ethical question, and I think that really little consideration out of this, and this should be part of a future framework of the right to be forgotten, also of user rights to be forgotten, that are more structural than only just one or two lines in the GDPR. Thank you very much.
Yes, so I will follow up. I just wanted to add that this is something that partially the DSA also deals with, not immediately the right to be forgotten. Of course, that is already included in the GDPR, and it's about the enforcement, but about options and about interoperability. Right now, you can send email from your Proton Mail to another one's Gmail, and we consider it completely normal, right? But you cannot send from your Telegram to a Messenger or Signal, message to someone else, and we find it completely normal too, but it should not be normal. We should be able to choose the platform where we are, so that we are not bound if we don't want to be on the outskirts of society, so that we are not bound to one platform, which then of course causes the other problems, such as the problems with abuse of our data, because of course if the company gets so big that it is the only one operating on the market, or the one of the few, then of course it will do even more things with our data that we cannot control anymore. And as I mentioned, the DSA focus on decentralized, local, user-owned and privacy-friendly alternatives is something very important. And I think that the interoperability and this focus is also, let's say, a little way out. So if the person behind the question is asking like how to delete the Facebook account, maybe it is not currently possible. We are trying to do as much as we can through the GDPR. However, we should also focus on the long term and on the alternatives to Facebook accounts.
So much. I guess a related question, but on a slightly different topic from the audience is, can the algorithm be tricked? Which is asked half in jest and half seriously. And a question to all of you also is to comment a little bit about the link between data protection and mental health issues that arise for individual users. I obviously can't see when you raise your hands, apparently, so feel free to speak if you feel like it.
So then I start with a kind of algorithm be tricked question, maybe. Of course, every algorithm can be tricked, but the problem is you need to know how. And so I worked in a research project together with the German police forces, and it was about live tracking in complex police operations. And you could trick this tracking algorithm pretty easily if you know how. And this is exactly the point. We put algorithmic decision making into a black box, and people do not know how a decision has been made, let alone how an algorithm can be tricked. So I think we should focus more on the decision making process than on the being tricked process in the first place.
Thank you.
I would like to add something on this for the very same question. So tricked, I'm not really sure what the question is intended to mean, but it reminds me of also cases that we see in our consultation where the algorithms are somehow tricked or misused to harass people because they are so predictable. For example, you can say that if a profile is reported 50 times or 100 times, nobody knows how many times you have to report it. But if you do it just for no reason and without any reason to do so, then it will be closed. And for the victims, it's really hard to get their profile back because they do not reach somebody at the platforms. They receive just 1 or 2 times the very same text block, and after this, they have no options to do anything to get back their profile. Other than to maybe hire a lawyer and pay a lot of money to try to fight to get the profile back if it's really important to them. But to be honest, most of the users are not crazy enough to just litigate against online platforms on their own without any assistance because they just know that this will be very costly, it will take very long, and it's very hard, and they have no knowledge about it, so they will just be inactive, and that's especially what the platforms rely on. And that's a problem, what I see, that the predictability of algorithms also leads to the fact that it's much easier to misuse them and really turn it against the users.
Thank you. Do either of the other 2 speakers want to comment? Go ahead.
I think that on the first question, there has been said everything that I also think, so I won't add more to that. As for the other question, yes, that is extremely important point because mental health issues is a topic that's sometimes being a little bit overlooked when we are talking about social media. However, especially with the new generations that have their whole life on social media sites from the beginning of their life, it's a crucial issue. And we can also see that it's not only about what it does to them, let's say, naturally, like because there is more of a, that there happens, of course, even threats and issues like that, but also what the platforms themselves do to keep the users there, where they are trying through likes and dislikes, etc., to create dopamine or other tricks to keep the users on the platform for as long as possible and keep them in bubbles, even if the bubble is, let's say, negative one, in which you are getting messages about how there is one catastrophe after another and something terrible, because the algorithm thought that, you know, you like that, you want to see that. And of course, cyberbullying. So this is a whole another topic to be discussed. And I think that this is something that the new generation of legislations and something that will come after GDPR should also focus on. It doesn't say that GDPR, I don't say that GDPR does not focus on that at all, but it is more on the side way, because of course, we didn't have enough data on how huge of a problem it is when GDPR was put into place. But now we do, and data protection is not only because of privacy, which is nice, but you know, a lot of people can be like, I don't need it, security is important more, but now it's actually about human lives and whether they want to take them because of what the platforms are doing to them, or what people do with their data against them. So yeah, I would just mention it like this, that this is definitely something that the EU legislators should and will focus on in the future. And yeah, it's a big issue.
Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to comment?
I could add just a little bit too to all the really thoughtful comments that have come before. So first, about the algorithm being tricked, absolutely. You can be tricked. I think that it was addressed quite well. And I think it's also important to remember that the algorithm can also trick you. that you get tricked by the algorithm into thinking that you might be interested in that, or you just click on something and then it creates a sort of self-reinforcing loop of endless toxicity, but yeah, that you can also be tricked and you can also trick it. And the second point about the mental health issues, I think this is an enormous problem that is completely underreported, in part because for the younger generation, as Marketa was mentioning earlier, it's normal to them, and then I think for many of us, we just get so numbed out to actually how we feel online. I mean, so much of social media is designed to numb you out from your feelings, disconnect you from your feelings. And I think that this is a very fruitful avenue of research that needs to be pursued. And, it really gets back to, this point of actually slowing down a little bit and thinking about what are we making and why are we making this? I mean, there's abundant research that shows that social media is clearly linked to depression in teenage girls. I mean, it's not, and for what? For, a couple extra cents of quarterly earnings for shareholders? I don't think that's necessarily worth it. But it's something that needs to be part of the conversation going forward and normalized. And also, I think it's important to recognize the acts of each one of us in contributing to that. Whenever we like something or we share something, or even we interact with some content online, in some platforms, this can be indicative to the algorithm that this content might be of interest to other people in our network, right? Based on the idea that, people are quite similar in their likes and connect together based around their likes. So that puts a bit of an ethical obligation on all of us in what kind of content do we actually engage with on our social media platforms? What do we share with other people which might influence their feeds? What do we retweet or whatever? So it's 100%. I mean, a lot of it's on the platforms, but also like, what are we doing in the meantime? I had a mentor who used to say, what are we doing on the way to the revolution? So it's like, yeah, exactly. So on the way to changing this, how am I interacting with content online and keeping other users' mental health in mind?
Thank you so much. I kind of want to ask you all a question that's linked to everything we were talking about, but especially linked to the algorithm tricking us, and to kind of that connection with human biases in disseminating information and content to users. And to ask you about the example of Facebook. For example, when there were all these reports about how the platform itself was blocking information on Palestine, for example, and people's accounts were being deactivated. If you could comment a little bit on that and on how the algorithm does this to begin with, and what users can do to kind of have more free access to information, even though as many of you pointed out, a lot of the people who work obviously at Facebook are humans. It might not be a very diverse workforce. They might have particular views on what should be allowed and what should not be allowed. So I just want to kind of put this question out there because it's also very important for people who work on kind of more emancipatory politics and want to share this kind of information on these platforms that are seen to be quite, free spaces of universal knowledge or whatever. And we had a question from the audience as well about, the person says, do you think a personal identification upon entering social media space would solve the issue of online violence? If yes, what would be the downside of this? And I think this question is more directed at Josephine, but any of you can comment if you feel like it.
Okay, maybe I can start. So on the first question, I have two thoughts on this that might not be the very most practical ones, but I can really say that there is right now a file being negotiated that will determine the rights of users in the next decades, maybe even, which is the Digital Services Act. And if you want your voices and also the voices of marginalized groups to be heard, then I can really only appeal to civil society to really act on this file and to really, take a closer look at it, and to also voice your concerns if you have some on it and on the practical implications it might have in the future. So that's my very activist advice that I can give here, because I'm really convinced that it's very important to not overlook the DSA and to have more. To just also acknowledge the importance it will have for the future of user rights. So the second questions, I had some problems in understanding the part in the middle, but it was about identification on social media. Is that correct? Or online platforms in general? Okay. The question here is if we are in favor of using clear names, full names on social media, which is something that I consider to be a very dangerous approach. Of course, anonymity on the internet is a problem from the cases that we are dealing with. And we are already cooperating with a specialized law enforcement unit here to support the victim when they want to file criminal complaints. We achieve only an identification rate of 1/3. So that means 2/3 of the perpetrators cannot be identified and cannot be prosecuted or not be filed a lawsuit against. And this is already in a specialized unit. In other units, we see really worse numbers, because the options that we have to investigate on the internet are not very good. And it's very easy to just set up as many profiles as you want with completely invented data. So this is a fact that we have to face, even if we talk about anonymity, which is very important on the internet. The thing that I would ask to talk about and to think about how we could put this into practical use is if we find a way to maybe verify data, which does not mean that you have to use your clear name when you act on the internet, but that there could be an option to identify you, to identify who is the person behind the account. For authorities, for example. Of course, there are also human rights aspects that we have to discuss in countries where we do not see that much democracy, to say it like this. But this is something that we should discuss, because what I sometimes don't understand is why we want to have this goal of complete anonymity on the internet that we do not have in any other aspect of life. So that's my take on this, but I would be also happy to discuss this with the other panelists, of course.
Thank you so much. And I will open the floor to the rest of the panelists. I just want to let you all know we have 4 more minutes. So please go ahead if you want to comment.
I may just quickly and briefly, so that other speakers can also speak. To the first one, I would just like to mention that it's not about the diversity, or not so much within the companies themselves, within Facebook, etc. It is pretty much and easily what is the bigger market and who pays the most. Facebook and other giants do not have responsibility towards society. They have responsibility towards their shareholders and towards their advertisers. Therefore, if a bigger market is China, then Hong Kong activists and protesters will be blocked. If a bigger market is Turkey, then Kurds will be blocked. It's as easy as that. And it's, of course, a question for how to tackle that. To the other thing, of course, I am also vastly against personal identification, and I would want to make one case why not, because it's not just about I will simplify it, the good guys being harassed by the bad guys. It's also about activists and so-called the good guys or whoever who needs to stay in anonymity. Otherwise, their, for instance, authoritarian government would find them and put them in jail, such as in Belarus, in Turkey, journalists, activists, or in Hong Kong. They also need to stay in anonymity, and they also need platforms where they can interact. I vastly recommend reading Twitter and Tear Gas for this, and I won't further prolong this. Just a little mention. Maybe you've heard and saw that porn sites started doing this to tackle revenge porn, but porn sites are a functioning model in the personal identification because it is based on profit. But we on platforms are not a company. We are not seeking profit. We are society. We are seeking interaction. So I don't think there should be applied the same model. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Marco or Cameron, if you would like to comment.
Trying to be mindful of the time.
I completely second the other two speakers.
Yes.
In that case, I have been told that we have 5 extra minutes if any of you would like to engage with each other as well. Otherwise, I'll wrap it up. But any final words?
Well, I wanted to just address the comment that was made about the content about Palestine on Facebook that was shared. And this is unfortunately this is a pattern that we've actually seen, elsewhere that happens with regards to content referring to this specific issue. Unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy solution about it in terms of, minus sort of guerrilla sharing on social media. But one of the issues that is arising from this, as we've seen on the right wing, is that this kind of censorship starts to push certain elements of society into alternative platforms. And I don't think that that's particularly helpful. And I would really, encourage individuals to try to, as much as they can, take part in, various protests or work with their lawmakers or whatever to, let platforms know that this kind of content, needs to be shared, needs to be talked about. It might make people uncomfortable or, confront their biases. But that's every day you wake up, your biases are confronted and made uncomfortable by just being a human being. This is not another, every day is a load of these situations. And so I really hope that people push back and also, encourage thoughtful modes of resistance against this sort of stuff. We saw people oftentimes, doing things in the comments or sharing, image files and, which would actually have the sort of censored content in a way that was more difficult to, AI can't necessarily identify text in an image as easily as it can in a traditional post, for example. So I encourage individuals to be creative, to ensure that, these, truly deeply marginalized voices like the Palestinians, are heard and acknowledged, or at least shared and talked about in a more constructive way. You don't have to agree with it, but I think, it's a better world if we can actually share this stuff and talk about it. So I really, there's no easy answer because these platforms are so centralized, but users have an enormous amount of power. These platforms are so enormous because users have power. That's the thing we often forget. They got there because of us, not because of them.
Maybe I can just add quickly something on the point of the platforms, because we've seen in the past and also in our work even that what works best is, of course, economical interests. So we saw that the protests of ad companies was very, very useful to trigger some measures that civil society asked for a very long time already before. And public pressure. So when I take a look at our litigation financing, then the cases against platforms that worked best were the ones where public figures were involved, because there was a reputation damage to be feared, and that's why they were more eager to comply there than in many other situations. So this is what we see is that public pressure is crucial. And when we look at the Facebook files, we see that this confirms just everything civil society was thinking and telling all the time, that they know about all of this. They know about all of this for a very long time, but they did not act because of economic interests. And that's, I think, where we have to grab the platforms to demand change as a society because of the very harmful consequences that these huge players can have.
Thank you so much. I very sadly have to wrap this up with all of you because we are out of time, even though it really was a pleasure listening to all your talks and learning a lot more about all of these things that really affect my life as well, but that I don't actually work on. So thank you so much for being here.